Welcome back for the reassembly video of this HTC M9. There's a couple things I didn't actually remove out of this. Just the earpiece speaker is still in the mid-frame. We're going to go ahead and start putting these SIM card slot and the SD card slot back in, since they did a great job and made these removable on the back of this device rather than hiding them underneath the screen. They just pop right back in. It's really hard to mess these up putting them in. They have some little guides and cutouts where they'll fit in perfectly. So we'll put in the both connector slots. Now on this side here, you want to make sure you put the little board down at the top. That would go right next to the front-facing camera. Make sure that the ribbon cables are nice and straight and not held down or pushed underneath anything. This one you want to make sure that the screw hole lines up. It's actually a little bit off-center, so we're just going to double check that real fast. So we're just going to try to wiggle this to the right a little bit. We just want to make sure that the screw hole on the bottom left-hand corner here actually is free and clear, and that you can push a screw all the way through. The logic board bottom left screw will go right through this portion of this card tray. The next step is we're going to go ahead and put the logic board back in place, or the daughter board. Now we do have a couple things attached here. I went ahead and put the rear-facing camera back on. Be much easier to attach it now. And this ribbon cable here as well, we'll put it on before we put this board back down. Just make sure everything lines up properly once we insert it back into its rightful spot. Now I put the camera back in because the ribbon cable attaches to the back of this daughter board, and it would be really a beast to get back on if it's not already attached to it when we put it in. So you want to make sure that your earpiece speaker is nice and in there. I didn't remove this one, it just will take a little bit of force to get it out. So to put the camera in, you can either lay it down flat and then try to move it to the right underneath the clip, or put it underneath the clip and then kind of use a pry tool to try to get the back of the camera to sit down inside of the slot. It's a little tricky, especially since it's adhered to the board and you don't want to do too much with it. You don't have a lot of room to play with it because you don't want to disconnect it from the board. But honestly, it looks like maybe the better way would be to put it in flat and then try to move it to the right a little bit and try to unclip the metal housing of the camera underneath, rather than do it the way that I'm doing. This takes a few seconds to get it to pop into place properly. There we go. Now that the camera is seated, we can go ahead and make sure we clip the two clips up here at the top in, just right here, and the one on the right side, right over here. Now this does have a lot of little gold connectors that pop off the board that attach to the back of the housing. Just make sure you don't bend any of these down. Make sure your front-facing camera is in its correct socket spot. Go ahead and put our card reader in the correct spot. I'm just going to insert that cable and then flip down the latch there. Put our battery in. Take it, we're going to slide it up toward the top and then press down at the bottom here. And actually, you know what'll be easier is to actually put this metal tape down onto the mid-frame first and then put the battery in. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the little adhesive tape off the battery. We're going to go ahead and put that down first. So it'll kind of wrap around, and then you can kind of tuck it in up against the bottom of the mid-frame there. Take our battery, just pull the cables back a little bit, and just kind of drop it back into place. Just make sure nothing's stuck underneath the battery. Any of the ribbon cables all need to be pulled out. Just make sure that it's lined up properly. You can go ahead and fold the adhesive tape back down on top of the battery once you get it into the right spot. Just pressing down on the sides where the adhesive was to make sure the battery's adhered nicely. If you did bend it when you're removing it, just make sure it's bent nice and flat before you put it back in. I'm going to go ahead and put in our connection for the opposite side for the card reader. This will just snap down. Next step is to go ahead and put in the 4 screws, one in each corner of the device. First one going through the silver tape on the bottom right hand side. We'll put our top right hand side screw in. One in the upper left hand corner. These are the 4 black screws that we removed from this device. And then the last bottom left hand corner is the one that goes through the card reader slot that we were trying to line up properly earlier. Alright, now with the top portion reassembled, we're going to go ahead and start on the bottom portion here. Just making sure none of my cables are bent or stuck underneath anything. So we're going to go ahead and put the little charge port cable back in. Now you want to be careful, there's a little metal cover that sits on top of the USB port here that can pop off. You don't want to line up the little post just to the right of the ribbon cable here. It just needs to sit right back down on top of it. There it is, this little piece can pop right off. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back on. You'll see there's 2 little holes in the metal piece. One will line up with a post sticking out just right below the battery. Now to make sure this stays in place, we're going to go ahead and put our 3 screws back in, the 2 on either side of the USB port and then one to the left. These are the 3 black screws we removed earlier. Alright, now that's in nice and secure. We can go ahead and put our bottom speaker back in. Now this needs to go and snap back, and there's a little clip right here we talked about in the disassembly video. Just make sure it snaps back in, and then it's sitting nice and flush across the bottom. Now we can take our logic board and go ahead and insert it back into its rightful spot on this. Now, this is the tricky part. You need to make sure that no ribbon cables are pushed underneath, except for the one cable that's connects to the top portion that needs to wrap around underneath the board. So we're just going to wiggle this and remove all the cables from underneath it. Make sure there's nothing caught under the bottom left-hand side. The bottom speaker cable is pulled up. You want to line the screws holes up at the top, and then the board will fit down here at the bottom as well. Once we have that done, we can go ahead and put our little vibration module back in place. It should have a little bit of adhesive on it still. It'll just stay nice and snug in its spot. You'll see there's a foam flat pad that faces up, and the rounded edge goes down. Make sure that these little grommets are pulled out correctly and facing the right direction. We're going to go ahead and tuck our black wire cable here underneath this grommet. There's a little guide slot for it. You need to put it underneath. Now this cable was run underneath the cable for the card reader slot here. Honestly, I haven't seen a difference in any of the phones on this particular cable, since I think it's in all 3 phones, if it runs just to the top of the cables instead. Go ahead and put a screw in here at the top. Screw to the left of the camera. These are the 3 silver screws that we removed. Then one down here at the bottom. You may have to move this capped on tape right here that's next to the ribbon cable. We're just going to use a pair of tweezers to pull it out from underneath the logic board. And we'll put that back down once we have the screw in place. You'll have to move up the speaker ribbon cable to get that in place. Go ahead and put our capped on tape back down. I'm realizing I just put a wire cable underneath the logic board. I was talking about how to not do that, and then I just did it. So we're just going to pull this screw back out and pull this cable out here real fast. So you want to make sure before you go too much further that all your cables are out from underneath that board. Because once you start reassembling all of those cables, you have to pull them all back up to try to get some of that stuff out. So just be careful with that and double check your work. Alright, now with that done, we're going to go ahead and start connecting these cables here. Now if you left your capped on tape on, it might make it a little bit easier to insert some of them. You want to make sure the white flap to the back of the cable slot is pulled up. Put the cable in as far as you can and then push that little clip back down. It'll secure it in place. Sometimes these can be a little bit tricky to get back in place. So you don't want to force them too hard. They'll go in very easy once you get them in the correct spot. And for me, it always seems like it's a little bit lower than I think it should go into. It's not going in the middle of the connector, it's actually at the bottom of the connector. Go ahead and flip this flap down. Now the one that curls underneath the board can be a little bit tricky as well, as it can be hard to bend back into its rightful spot. So just take your time and line it up. Make sure it's in nice and snug. Now you want to make sure all these cables are in. So if not, you may get some things not functioning correctly for you, like your SIM card slot or reading your SD cards. Go ahead and put down our volume and our power button ribbon cable here, since we just connected that. Just use a pair of tweezers or something to press down around the buttons to make sure the adhesive re-adheres. We put the rear housing back on, it stays put. Go ahead and put our ribbon cable in for the charge port. Needs to be flipped back up. So these two little wire antenna connectors here are not hard to not mix up. So the gray one goes below and the blue one goes atop. The black one goes right in between the other two larger brass looking connections on the rhythm device where you think it might clip into, but it's the smaller of the three there. So we're just going to try to line this cable up so it fits in between the metal housing and the ribbon cable connectors. Then we'll put our tape down and kind of hold it back in place. Now if the cable seems a little bit loose, you can just pull this little connector a little bit sideways. It'll pull the connection, the wire tighter for you. Just make sure that it's guided underneath and it's not protruding anywhere. So we have a couple of cables right here that need to be reattached to the top. These can be easy to confuse where they went, but the left cable on the back of the daughter board goes to the left connector on the logic board, and the further in cable, the right cable, goes to the further in on the logic board, the right connection. So once you know that, they're pretty hard to not mix up, but you want to make sure they're connected properly. I did this once on, I think it was an M7, and the Bluetooth didn't function anymore, so make sure you put them on the correct connectors. You don't want to have to disassemble your phone. Now we can take a little grommet that goes over the flash, our water sensor here. You'll notice there's a little guide slot underneath the cables that actually fits the cables underneath it. So make sure that those are lined up properly to go underneath that guide slot so there's no bulging under this grommet. You can see the red side of that litmus paper there. It'll fit right on top of the connector. Now go ahead and reconnect the ones down here at the bottom as well. Now normally I like to wait and push the battery connector down as much as possible. We're going to have to do that here in a second. Let's go ahead and reconnect our rear speaker, our bottom speaker, to its ribbon cable slot as well. And I'll make it easy to put these two little wire connectors on. Just remember, from moving here forward, don't use any metal tools on your device if the battery is still connected. I've never had any sort of an electric static discharge or any issues with shorting, but better safe than sorry. Now these little wire connections can be a little bit difficult. Just make sure you use moderate pressure to put them back on. Just line them up properly. You can bend them, so just be careful about that. Don't press too hard if it doesn't feel like it wants to go on properly. We have these two little capped on tape connectors we're going to go ahead and put back on. One over the SIM card slot here, and the other goes back down over the bottom speaker connector. Alright, so we have everything connected. Now we're going to go ahead and power it on and make sure it's going to work for us. We do have a screen. That's a good sight for us. Now before you put the back cover on, I would go through and I would test everything. I would test your Wi-Fi, test your Bluetooth, make sure you can make calls, all of that stuff to make sure it works properly. If you're not too worried about it, you can go ahead and put your back on, and then if you have to remove it, you have to remove it. But it's easier just to test everything and make sure it functions properly before you do so. We're just going to test the touch function and then put our back cover on and make sure that everything's working. If your touch or your LCD doesn't work, it's the cable to the right side of the battery that we never removed that was still in there. So just check that connection. You can see we can turn these on. You can turn on the Wi-Fi. You can turn on the Bluetooth. Perfect. Looks like the touch is functioning properly. Now, one last thing we need to do before we put everything back together is put our screws in for our battery connector. So we have two Phillips screws that were holding this down, so we'll go ahead and put those back in. Once that's done, we can go ahead and put our rear cover back on. And it's easiest to take it and slide it down into the bottom slot first. Doesn't take a lot of sliding, so you want to put it in almost, just barely put in the USB and the 3.5mm headphone jack. So So snap it right back in, make sure they're lined up properly, then work your way up. You can just basically snap the sides in all the way up to the top. You can press pretty firm here. You want to make sure that those snaps are nice and tight. So when you put your things in, like your SIM card slot and your SD card slot back in, that they line up properly. So just make sure you double check all the snaps on it. Sometimes it'll seem like the seam's pretty tight, but it'll still snap back into place. Next step is to go ahead and take our 2 screws that are holding the top portion together and put those back in place. Doesn't have to be extremely tight, you just want them nice and snug. Alright, the next step is to go ahead and put our little plastic grommet back in. So we're going to snap in the one side, and I find the easiest way to do this is to take a tool, put it right underneath the middle. That'll give you the little bend in the top housing, and then you can put in the snap for the other side, then let it down and push the adhesive back together. Perfect. And that is the reassembly of the HTC M9. Now if I do get a broken screen, I'll try to do a screen replacement, possibly a glass only for you. With this particular phone, I didn't want to damage the screen, but if I have one in the future, I'll go ahead and update this video. If you found the video helpful, hit that like button. If you have any questions, throw them down in the comments. I'll do my best to get to them. If you like the video, subscribe to see future videos. And as always, I appreciate you watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.